Hi, everyone. Welcome as you're coming in. We'll get started in just a few minutes, and feel free to let us know where you're from by putting that in the chat box. All right, we're going to get started. We're so glad that you are joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this NCA webinar, Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day Story. My name is Jill Annable. I'm the Executive Director for Academic Excellence here at NCA, and I'm joined by two great guests today, Martin Doblmeier from Journey Films and Adam Zoller from St. Xavier High School. We're going to turn to prayer first.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. This is a prayer for community. Embracing Father, you grace each of us with equal measure in your love. Let us learn to love our neighbors more deeply so that we can create peaceful and just communities. Inspire us to use our creative energies to build the structures we need to overcome the obstacles of intolerance and indifference. And may Jesus provide us the example needed and send the Spirit to warm our hearts for the journey. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Well, I have the honor of introducing our two guests today, and we're going to have a great conversation about Dorothy Day in just a bit here. So bring your questions and all of your insights. Just a few logistics. You are welcome to submit any questions in the Q&A. You're also invited to join the conversation in the chat box. If you have specific questions, please put those in the Q&A so we make sure we don't miss them. And then afterward, you will have a survey, and that will help you have certificate of participation if you wish to have that. Okay, so our first guest here is Martin Doblmeier. He's the founder and president of Journey Films, a film and television production company in Alexandria, Virginia, with a focus on religion, faith, and spirituality. He holds degrees in religious studies, broadcast journalism, and 3 honorary degrees. He has 3 regional Emmy Awards, is a 3-time winner of the U.S. International Film Festival, 5-time winner of the Wilbur Award, and an 8-time winner of the prestigious Gabriel Award for Best Film on the topic of religion. Since 1985, he has produced 35 films and has aired mostly on PBS, but also on ABC, NBC, the BBC, and the History Channel. He's filmed in over 50 countries, and that is quite a list to follow. So not to be overshadowed, we also have Adam Zoller. He is coming to us from the theology department at St. Xavier High School in Louisville, Kentucky. He has 2 decades of experience in male adolescent education and formation, teaching in both Carmelite and Xaverian traditions. He's earned his BA in religious studies and BA in clinical psychology and an MA in educational leadership. He holds a master's catechist certificate in his Archdiocese of Louisville. He's also a writer for us. So he has done some blogs for NCA. He's also published in the Catholic Journal of Ed. And he's worked on, this is the connection here, he has worked on educational materials for Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day Story, and he brings all of his experience in the classroom to us today. It is such an honor to have you both with us. I can't wait for our conversation.
Well, thank you for having us, Jill. I'm looking forward to it.
Before we get too far, we are going to tee up a trailer of the film. Some of you have seen the documentary, some of you have not, and that's okay. We're inviting you to this conversation. Everyone who has access to the NCA 2021 convention will have access to the film. So that if you haven't yet seen it, that's your next step. And then you can also go to Journey Films if you want to broadcast it in your classroom and have your own copy. So we're going to see a little bit of this, so we have enough to talk about, and then we'll get our conversation going.
In many ways, Dorothy Day was a typical grandmother.
I see my grandmother as someone who was very ordinary, but also very extraordinary. I mean, I understood that she was different.
Different because Dorothy Day was so often on the front lines, protesting war and nuclear buildup, creating houses of hospitality for the hungry and homeless, and earning her place on the FBI watch list as a dangerous American.
Yeah, Dorothy Day is a big troublemaker.
As a young journalist, Dorothy Day campaigned for those in need.
Her work keeps putting her front and center in the social movements of the time.
She wrote about workers' rights, child labor. She was attracted to communism, believing it was a way to improve people's lives. All part of a chapter in her own life that would leave its scars. But with the birth of her daughter, Dorothy Day turned from communism and converted to the Catholic faith. There, she discovered a path that for nearly a half-century led her to become one of the greatest champions for the poor America has ever known.
She thought if communism is radical, why shouldn't Christianity be radical? This is radical.
My grandmother always said that she never meant to start houses of hospitality. She never meant to open up soup lines. But what happens when you start writing about these things, people show up at the door.
She wanted the people to exercise their own sense of personal responsibility. You see something that needs to be done, you do it.
But accepting the biblical challenge to be peacemakers also compelled her to become a pacifist without compromise, to use her Catholic worker movement and the newspaper she founded to resist America's intervention in any war. Many believed her behavior was un-American.
She did describe herself as an anarchist.
There's an anarchist dimension to her Christian witness.
Some of the most profound and most rewarding demonstrations that culminated in arrests were with the Catholic worker community.
I think of Dorothy Day as a firecracker that never goes out.
Now this grandmother and anarchist may well be declared a saint.
We'd love to see Dorothy made a saint. For both American middle-class people and for Catholics, they recognized that something extraordinary was going on. They weren't quite sure what to do with it.
She annoyed people because she challenged them.
She would say, don't call me a saint. I don't want to be written off that easily.
Well, I think if you take the Lord's words, you'll find they're pretty rigorous. The Sermon on the Mount may be read with great enjoyment, but when it comes to practicing it, it really is an examination of conscience to see how far we go.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, so we could all start kind of in the same place. And feel free in the chat box too to tell us how familiar you are with Dorothy Day. I think that will help us in our context too. But I want to start with a question for Martin. So you have been making documentary films since the 80s, including many on Catholic figures. So why Dorothy Day and why now?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jill, and everybody at NCEA for having the session. And I think really that Dorothy Day is just, I think she's arguably the most important, influential Catholic lay figure of the 20th century. I mean, that's just flat out, no question about it in our minds. And I think in many ways, she embodies so much of what Catholic social teaching is supposed to be about. And she didn't necessarily do that intentionally. I think she simply did it as a reaction to the world that she saw going on around her. And she had no other choice but to actually take action based on the faith tradition that she had come to love and care about. So for me, I think there's natural drama in her story. I think that's what makes it, I think, really an interesting film topic as far as a documentary film. But I also think from a religious perspective, a faith perspective, that this is somebody who cannot be ignored. And I think the fact that she became such a prominent, important figure in the 20th century and continues to be an important figure in the 21st century is more than a reason to make a documentary film about her.
That's incredible. The first time we talked, Martin, I was telling my own story about being a middle schooler in our Catholic schools and learning about Dorothy Day and coming home and my parents being upset. It was the first time I knew that there was a broad range of people who are Catholic and a broad range of opinions about other people who are Catholic and influential. And it actually made me more interested in Dorothy Day. It made me very pro-life. It made me very connected to reconciliation and our process of Catholics to reconcile relationships with God and the journey we have on earth. And I felt very connected to her. So the next thing I want to ask you about is actually connected to that, because fast forward to 2015, you opened the film with Pope Francis addressing a joint session of Congress in 2015. At that point, I was a high school teacher in a Catholic school, and we watched it, and something extraordinary happens in this address. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, Pope Francis comes to the United States 2015, like you said, not long after he's taken over the reins of the Catholic Church, comes to America and talks to the American lawmakers, to Congress. It's really an historic moment. And he names 4 seminal figures in American history that he thought were really the greatest figures in American history: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. And what's really fascinating about Dorothy Day is, in her own time, Dorothy Day was considered an anarchist. She was on the FBI watch list. Many people would have thought she was not a very American character. And yet he had the courage to stand up and say, no, from a Catholic Church's perspective, this is an extraordinary, an unforgettable figure that has to be remembered in the course of your own history as Americans. And we thought that was a wonderful way to start off the film, not just as an endorsement by the head of the Catholic Church, but to say that Dorothy Day is not just a great Catholic figure, she's a monumental American figure.
Yeah, and I loved in the film too, I forget who it was maybe Congressman who was like, and we all thought, who's Dorothy Day? Like they recognize a list, they knew what he may address, and then here comes someone who is kind of brought up and re-energized in that moment. So
Jill, I've had people write to me and say, well, why are you making a film on Doris Day? You make films on religion. And so we would have to go back and say, no, it's Dorothy Day, and it's just a remarkable character.
Yeah. All right. Adam, we've left you out. I have a question for you now. So let's talk about classrooms a little bit. You've helped create the educational materials for the film. So why Dorothy Day in the classrooms of your high schoolers as an important figure in our schools?
Well, I think just to echo what Martin said a moment ago about thanks for the opportunity to be here. My experience is in almost 20 years, and I recognize I'm only teaching in an all-male secondary school. But adolescents haven't changed, and they definitely are going to respect people who practice what they preach. Young people can definitely see right through you. So if they know that if you're fake or you're phony in terms of your faith or your actions, they're going to see through that. And so I think it's someone that practices what they preach, and then therefore becomes not just a Christian witness, but a role model for young women and men. To look up and see this person as someone that they can strive for, to respect the dignity of the other person and to stand by what they believe in. In addition, we'll cover this a little bit later in this session today, there's just so many opportunities for interdisciplinary approaches in teaching her story. From the U.S. history perspective, as Martin just said, as one of the 4 figures that Pope Francis indicated, but also through an English class and through writing as a journalist, as Dorothy Day was, and then through social justice courses and even morality and the reconciliation, Jill, that you spoke of just a moment ago. So there's a lot of opportunity here for young people to learn her story from different perspectives and from different points of view.
Yeah, and so many times our students, and maybe myself included, exit out of our schools without understanding the sainthood. And we are called as Catholic educators to be leading all of our students toward sainthood. I mean, scholars and saints. And I think if we don't have examples of that in modern world, as flawed individuals, because we're human, I think there's just so much complexity there that it's hard to relate to the saints of the early days of the church. And I just appreciate this work. So staying with you here, I am wondering, Well, you know what? No, I'm going to ask both of you this question. Sorry, Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot. So how can you talk about your own experiences of learning about saints growing up? And then I'm going to go to Martin, because I know, Martin, you went to Catholic high school, and how about your experiences there too? So growing up, learning about saints, Dorothy Day and or others headed towards sainthood, what was your experience like?
Well, I'm a product of Catholic education through high school and college. And I think my experience of that is somewhat limited to the specific saint of the parish in which I attended, or the specific saint of the school in which I attended. So as a person, as a young boy, went to a grade school, St. Paul Parish. Obviously, we learned about St. Paul and his conversion. As a young person in high school, I went to St. Francis de Sales High School in Louisville, and therefore learned about Francis de Sales. And then now teaching at St. Xavier High School, learn about Francis Xavier. But in a way, back to my formation, it was very much limited to the school in which I was a part of. I mean, I think that's true for many parishes and schools that are going to focus on their own Catholic identity and focus on their own charism of the school. And then sometimes I think that's limited, and we don't have a larger net that's been cast to explore the other saints, especially more modern saints as well.
Fantastic. And then Martin, how did your formation lead to all this work?
Well, I too went to a Catholic high school. I'll put a plug in. I went to Bishop Hendricken High School in Warwick, Rhode Island. And I want to say that it was probably, as I look back at it now, it was my high school religion teacher who really opened the gates for me to let me know that religion wasn't just about the Baltimore Catechism and showing up on Sunday morning, but that there were so many other dimensions and possibilities that could be explored. And he was the one who would connect the teachings that we were getting for that week in the classroom and bringing us out into soup kitchens, bringing us out into caring for the people who were really in need. And so I'm getting an education at 15, 16, 17 years old in how the text that we're learning in the classroom relates to human beings, the reality of human beings in the real world. And he brought together for me people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Buber. He took us outside of the Catholic tradition and taught us these are all connected. Here's where our roots as Catholics go back in many ways to other teachings. And so that's one of the reasons why I was excited actually to do this webinar with you folks, because it gave me time to reflect about how important my own Catholic high school education really was. And if I can blame anybody for these last 40 years of doing these kinds of films, it has to be these high school religion teachers that I had during the experience when I was in my teens.
Absolutely. And, in the framework for high school catechesis from the USCCB gives Catholic social teaching an option as an elective, but we know that in every course, and in my own experience too, it was the questioning. It was like the freedom to question with people of the faith, like what's going on in our own lives and formation through the lives of the saints, through church history, through Catholic social teaching, that really leads to strong formation, which is why my own kids are in Catholic schools too, because we want to be surrounded by role models of the faith.
And I was also going to say that what's really wonderful too is that we now have the courage to ask the questions. I think there would have been a time generations earlier where we would not have been asking questions. You were going to learn what you had to learn. But now I think there's a confidence and an openness to say, it's time to be asking the serious questions, because we might not have all the answers, but we're working hard at trying to find out what those answers should be and what God is leading us to understand about the answers to these important questions. So I think it's a really interesting time in Catholic education.
I think so too. And our ability to inquire is a gift from God, and it leads us to truth and beauty and goodness. And all of that is happening in our schools in supported ways. And I mean, if our kids are going to ask the questions regardless of where they are, we would much rather have them ask of our parents and of our teachers through content like this film. So were there themes in the film, in the life of Dorothy Day, that you found particularly important or provoking?
Well, I think there are many themes in the film that are important, but I think one of the ones that I think might be provoking from the point of view of presenting them to Catholic high school in particular is Dorothy Day's notion. It's a profound notion of personalism, that each one of us can't simply sit back and wait for an institution, the state or nonprofit organization, to solve all the problems that are going out in the world, that we have an obligation as people of faith to take on what's going on around us and actually have our own personal response, that God calls us individually to respond and not to abdicate personal responsibility for that. So I think we have a clip for that. I don't know if you want to introduce it, Jill, but we have a clip from the film that talks directly about the notion of personalism.
Great. This is a great moment from the film. Absolutely.
We're living in these times, a time of tremendous failure of man's sense of responsibility for.
Nope.
What he is doing. He relinquishes it to the state. He's not obedient to his own, the promptings of conscience.
Those promptings of conscience, she believes, should compel people to help each other, one to one, an extension of a concept known as personalism.
This idea that every Christian has a personal responsibility to get involved in taking care of our brothers and sisters. When someone comes to us and asks for help, we can't say, well, the state office is down the street, or here, I can give you these coupons, but I can send you to the right office. So that's the wrong response. The response we're called on is that we ourselves have to do something for that person. The profound theological truth she saw was that we should do something for the other because that changes us. It doesn't just change the other person. We are changed.
For Dorothy Day, the notion of personal responsibility is directly tied to her understanding of the Catholic faith, a faith she converted to in her 20s.
She was a conservative Catholic, meaning the liturgy was important to her. She wasn't, as people might think, a religious leftist. So Dorothy, on theological matters, ecclesial matters, biblical matters, was actually quite conservative. And she was radical in her social, economic, political views because of her conservative faith.
So this is like the age-old question now for Adam. And in my former life, I was assistant superintendent in the Diocese of Grand Rapids. I oversaw all the curriculum. And as we refreshed our theology curriculum, it was the big questions of, can we teach this? You know, like, can we teach personalism? I want to hear, really, Adam, how have you approached this?
Well, I would say that if we're looking at the gospel message, and I think what Dorothy Day was mentioning is that it's not easy. It is a struggle. It's a challenge if you're truly a Christian witness to carry your cross and see the dignity in other people. And I think what I've focused on in 20 years of doing this is the importance of service. Is that putting, your action, the words into action. How do you volunteer at your parish? That's one thing, but how do you also serve the poor, the marginalized in the community? And I think that's the direction we can go. And so many programs in high schools offer service as a requirement. Obviously, in the sacraments, the sacrament of confirmation, a lot of programs offer or require service for that completion of that sacrament as well. And I think we have to do is not just make it a mandate by the high school teacher, but to continue to encourage families the importance of serving in their neighborhood, serving at their parish, serving in the community. So it's not just one more thing a student has to do to check off his list or her list in order to graduate high school or to receive a sacrament. It has to be a mindset, and in a way, that it obviously is going to take a village. It's going to take the student to understand that this is important, not just because theology teacher said so, or not just because the Catholic principle said so, but it's important because it also comes from the parish. It also comes from the priest. It also comes from coaches in the building or administrators, counselors. It also comes from the mom and dad or the guardians at home, that all of us together have to be on board to understand our charitable works and also specifically in social justice, trying to remove these root causes to improve the systems that so often hold people down in our society.
I was just going to add too that I think sometimes we think of education in a very didactic way, but I think sometimes the best teachers are simply the ones who open the eyes of the student, to let them see something through a new lens that they hadn't been able to see before. And that's what really sort of cuts through all the information down, and that speaks to the heart, directly to the heart. And then all of a sudden the information becomes important, because once you've actually connected to the heart, you've opened the eyes and connected to the heart, then all the other information that you're going to be given starts to have perspective. And so, at least in my own life, I know the teachers that had the most impact on me were the ones who simply opened my eyes.
Martin, I would agree. And so much of that comes from the experience, or the experiences, I would say, of service, that so often, if it becomes just a requirement, you have to do X amount of service hours, for a high schooler, it's just one more thing to do. But once you get them at that agency to do service, and they see other people who really do struggle in so many ways in our society, that experience does touch their heart. So when they come back to the classroom, the content, quote unquote content, actually begins to make sense. It's not just terms to memorize and then forget a week later.
Absolutely. And students are watching our example, and that's so big. My faith life was just broadened by being a teacher in Catholic education, knowing that we are being those witnesses, and through our service, they're watching and they're learning, and they're forming who they're going to be as young men and women. In the film, Martin, there are some things in there that really surprised me. And I'm wondering, as you were creating the film, were there moments where you were surprised by what you were learning?
Well, yes, with every film, I approach every film the same way. I do all my homework, all my research, and then I have to sort of open myself up to the surprises that I'm going to get along the way. And hearkening back to something that you said earlier about you didn't realize that there were people actually who were angry at Dorothy Day for certain things. I've been out on the road until COVID happened. I was out on the road much of January and February doing special events with the film. A lot of people who came out, especially in Catholic venues, who were involved in the military. And a lot of people love Dorothy Day, love the notion of the social service, but her politics didn't like that at all. Really upset by her politics. So she really serves it up in such a way that you've really got to, you have to look at her as a whole. This in her mind is all seamless as far as she's concerned, but for others it's not. And then two of the things that really came up to me that really surprised me, I didn't realize this. Here's a woman, Dorothy Day, who actually risks her life in her early years, in her late teens, early 20s, to be on the front lines in the suffragette movement. She's beaten to a pulp, put in jail, and out campaigning for the right for women to vote. Historic moment in American history. And then for the rest of her life, she never voted. She never voted. I mean, I asked the granddaughters, what is with that? How is that even possible? And they said, well, we have no explanation for it. She felt as though she couldn't participate in a government. She couldn't actually speak critically of a government that she was actually participating in. That was the logic that she uses. But in either way, she never was able to bring herself to vote. And the second thing is she didn't pay federal taxes. And and we bring that up in the film. We talk about that. Felt as though it was important to pay local taxes, pay for the hospitals, and pay for fire department and police and the roads and things like that. No way she was going to pay federal taxes, because that money might be used for nuclear weapons and things. So as a filmmaker, I tell the story as it is. That doesn't necessarily always mean that I believe, and I'm with her on everything as it goes, because Dorothy Day serves up a lot to have to deal with, and that's why I think she's so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and any of those who are headed towards sainthood aren't the quiet ones, right? And I think we have a lot to learn from stories from different eras of history of those who are holy. So at the time, Dorothy Day was considered a radical, yet today she's being considered for sainthood. Can you just tell us more about that? In the modern world, what is that like, and what is her story? Where does it fold into all of this?
Well, Dorothy Day is on a track to become a saint. And again, I say that how interesting this is. I mean, she was on the FBI watch list. She was considered a serious radical. There were a lot of people in the Catholic Church who were very disturbed by Dorothy Day in her lifetime. But here it is now, 2021, and she's already been declared a servant of God. So that means that the official process of her canonization is officially now accepted by Rome and is underway. Just as an interesting sidebar, that has to be initiated by the diocese or archdiocese where she came from. So New York had to advance the cause of Dorothy Day, and it was done by Cardinal John O'Connor, who in his day, especially in the 1980s, was probably as much a hawk on the board of the Catholic bishops as anybody out there. He was in charge of the military vicariate, the representative of the Catholic bishops to the military. And he was quite something else when it came to it. So they did not necessarily get along politically, but Dorothy Day passes away. And in the end of the 90s, he's actually realizes that a lot of people are talking about her canonization. And so in an open-minded act, he decides to bring in people for a conference, a gathering, to ask them, should I, as the Archbishop of New York, start this process of canonization? And to a person, they swayed him. And so he was one of the, I think he's one of the first miracles, frankly, that he was actually out there campaigning, advancing her cause for sainthood. So that began 20 years ago, 21 years ago, when they started with that. And then the last many years, what they've had to do is collect all the written material around Dorothy Day, do extensive interviews and have it all transcribed, collect all her letters, her diaries, her speeches, all her writings from the Catholic newspaper that Adam has put up here, the Radical and Saint, all the things that she wrote over the course of her lifetime, which were enormous amounts of material, and collect all of that, package it all together, and that's going to be going to Rome in the next few months. And they hope that will go then to the Congregation of Saints, and they'll hope within a short period of time that she would be declared venerable, which means that the church then would sanction the idea that you would venerate Dorothy Day, pray for her to intercede if you have personal issues or related to health or anything else. Then you need a miracle. If there's one miracle that can be identified in the life of Dorothy Day, then she would become blessed, and one more miracle and she becomes canonized as a saint. And so I had the privilege a number of years ago of spending some time with Mother Teresa, and here she is. She's moved through the process pretty quickly. She's already been canonized, Mother Teresa. So I have some reason to believe and hope that Dorothy Day will be canonized within the not too distant future.
That's fascinating. The whole story is so fascinating. Adam, I'm wondering then, what have been your experiences in teaching Dorothy Day in your classroom or from fellow teachers who are also, like, what are students' responses and what have you done?
Well, I think, and you alluded to this earlier, Jill, about the social justice course. The USCCB's core curriculum doesn't have social justice as a requirement, but is an elective that can be taken. So there are some limitations to covering Dorothy Day because of that. But at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, there's the concept of social justice is not limited to one course or course description. The idea of social justice is obviously brought up in the Gospels and Jesus's primary mission to minister to the marginalized. The concept of social justice is so much part of the prophets of the Old Testament. The disparity between rich and poor that Amos preached about, the corruption that was in the temple that was spoken by Ezekiel. So there's opportunities for social justice beyond a specific quote unquote social justice course. But what I do think though is that so often, in my experience, is that sometimes we get into the content and feel like we have to check boxes that we don't feel as if we can expand and bring in other people such as Dorothy Day and other what would be called maybe future saints or even modern day prophets into our curriculum, either because we feel as if our hands are tied because there's a specific curriculum we have to follow, or maybe just because sometimes we feel like maybe the lack of knowledge of some of the stories of these people. When Martin asked me years ago to help him with the educational materials, I knew some about Dorothy Day, but just through the process of working with him, I mean, the amount that I've learned through working with him and also reading her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, the formation for me as educator, the amount of knowledge I have now is so much more than I may have had 3 to 5 years ago. So I think that we have opportunities, but what we need is, if I can use teacher language for a moment, we need opportunities for professional development that's on these Catholic heroes, and especially modern day Catholic heroes like Dorothy Day. And I think that's going to help the development of the teacher in the classroom so they can then share that knowledge to the student in front of them.
Absolutely.
How do we get Catholic social teaching? This is a question for NCEA. How do we get Catholic social teaching on the menu? How do we even do that? I mean, it sounds as though everybody's concurrent about the need for it. What's the process for actually making that happen?
Yeah, it's there, and it's hard, right? So it's such a and I'm gonna ask you this next, Adam. Like you have your text and you have your framework and you have the things you're responsible for, but we also are living witnesses, and our students learn about our prayer life as role models of the faith and Catholic social teaching, and how we live out Catholic social teaching in response to our local community and the world. How do we see a Catholic worldview and all those things that we can live through social justice? And so I'm wondering, to beyond the text, Adam, what kinds of activities, what kinds around the themes of Day's life, what kinds of work have you seen?
Well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of opportunities for teaching Dorothy Day, and even though she may or may not be listed in textbooks as much as maybe Martin or I would like, but there's ways to teach. When you refer to life and dignity of the human person, and you talk about war and pacifism and activism. You can bring her up in those ways, especially in a morality class as a moral figure. You could obviously bring her up if social justice was a requirement, as we were just mentioning a moment ago. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit later, but Old Testament prophets, the term for this in Hebrew is Nabi, and a lot of times the connotation of that term was a crazy person or a madman. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Jill, that some of maybe the most vocal people that challenge the status quo are people that we look at, think that person might be crazy, but maybe not. Maybe they're trying to challenge us all to seek truth and make us all better people. So I think that in a way, Dorothy Day is this future saint, but also this prophet, this crazy person, and not diagnosed crazy person, but crazy person in the sense of Nabi in the Old Testament that challenges us to see the world differently. G.K. Chesterton said that a prophet is someone who sees the world upside down, like sitting on their head or standing on their head, that they see the world differently than the rest of us. So there's ways to talk about her as a moral figure. Obviously, there's ways to talk about her as someone who works for the dignity of the person in a social justice class. And there's ways to connect Old Testament figures of prophets to maybe more modern day prophets as well. Some other things, and then what I came up with here, and we'll see in the next few slides, are just examples of things you could do in a classroom teacher. Now, these are all geared towards secondary school, so they're all geared towards high school. And that's not to say that some of these ideas couldn't be modified to go to a middle school curriculum in a religion or theology class. But we're talking about pacifism, and if we're in a U.S. history course, we're talking about maybe World War II. Could students have some sort of dialogue, some sort of interview process, a dialogue, or even a skit where someone like the student plays the role of Dorothy Day, a student plays the role of FDR, a student plays the role of Winston Churchill, and they're all discussing the war and whether the war is just or whether the war is necessary or a need. Now, keep in mind, this type of activity, whether you do it as a skit or some type of dialogue or interview, I mean, it's controversial. I know that going into it, but I created it, the idea, because Dorothy Day was controversial on this mindset about the war. And earlier, as we kind of opened the presentation about Dorothy Day and what Pope Francis said about her, doing some research in a U.S. history class, why would Pope Francis choose these four Americans, as Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Dr. King, and Abraham Lincoln, as these such important or influential figures in our history? They may have knowledge already of President Lincoln from other classes of history in middle school and high school, but to look deeper into why these characters, these people, these figures were chosen by Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. I mentioned also there's an opportunity for in an English course or a writing course, or if there's an elective as a creative writing, can we write, as Dorothy Day was a journalist, can we challenge our students to have a writing assignment to maybe their school newspaper, which draws awareness to social inequalities? And there's a link on this slide that goes back to Journey Films, because that's one of the ideas I worked on with Martin, to say, let's model after Dorothy Day as a journalist, and let's advocate for change. And maybe there's issues at everyone's school, and all these schools are different in their neighborhoods and communities they're a part of. But maybe there's inequalities in the school building, or maybe there's inequalities in those cities where the schools are located, that students could write about these inequalities, since similar to how Dorothy Day would have done.
I love that. And it's bringing to light that our students bring passion to their, they would love to be passive learners in their seats, just listening to us profess to them, all these things, but they are passionate about topics and about social justice issues. They are, like, there's a passion in there, and helping them to find voice for that, to be countercultural with a Catholic worldview is part of our job, to figure out how are they going to find that voice? How can they analyze the time periods and the perspectives of those who have come before us, like you were talking about in those historical figures, is also really important. And I think that's complex. We don't want them to be passive Catholics. We want them to be active in church life and active in I am hoping, I don't know if I just timed out a little. So Martin, do you see Dorothy Day as a historic prophetic voice? Are there...
Sorry, I lost the question. You were cutting in and out.
So you see Dorothy Day as a historic prophetic voice, but are there others like her?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, yeah, there are. I mean, here's what's really interesting to me. I'm going to mention one in particular in just a second. But what's really interesting from Dorothy Day's time to our time is that in America in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when we had all these monumental questions about civil rights and nuclear war and Vietnam and all these big macro questions, especially the media would turn to religious figures and ask for perspective. That's how these people became better and better known, because the media was interested in getting a take on what a person like Dorothy Day think about these particular issues. We don't do that anymore. We don't turn to religious figures to get some sort of moral perspective on all the issues that we're dealing with. So you don't have figures like Reinhold Niebuhr, even Martin Luther King Jr. These were people that we would turn to and ask for their sort of prophetic vision of what's happening here. How should we think about this? And yet there are still wonderful, wonderful people doing great work that's very Dorothy Day-like. I'm thinking in particular of a nun at the border between the US and Mexico, Sister Norman Pimentel. And I had a chance to talk to Sister Norma, and she's helped over 100,000 people who found themselves at the border down between the US and Mexico. And she works for Catholic Charities. She's a wonderful Dorothy Day-like figure. Yet she's different too, because I don't see her as the same kind of political action figure. She's certainly doing the good work that Dorothy Day would have done. Like she's created the equivalent of Catholic worker houses response at the border, but she's not acting in a political way. She's not in Washington, D.C. like Dorothy Day would have been, coming in to sort of campaign about these kind of figures. But there are figures out there. I'm also thinking of Sojourners. One of the people in the film is Jim Wallace. Very, very charged political figure that I think does that out of a solid grounding of his faith tradition, really knows his text, knows his scriptures, knows his religious teachings, and knows that calls him to be a prophetic witness, a prophetic voice on issues of race and inequity in terms of the economic sphere in our country. So there are people out there doing it. My problem is that as a filmmaker, I feel as though it's almost my obligation to raise these people up, because the media tends not to do that anymore, like they might have half a century ago.
Yeah, it's the slow, steady stories, that shape our day. The road to sainthood is not one stop awardee moment, right? So I think that doesn't hit the news like all the other breaking news stories that get people's attention. So it's our job to, again, be countercultural in that and raise those voices and bring to light the rest of the truth, the rest of our society. So that's great.
And one more thought that I had about Dorothy Day, we forget to remember her as a journalist as well. She starts her career as a journalist. And so she always had the macro picture in mind. She was out there looking at systems, the way they served or failed us. in this country. And so she would write articles for the Catholic Worker publication that were all going after the macro picture. And then that afternoon, when she finished that article, she would go downstairs and literally feed one person who needed to be fed. So she was living both in the wider sphere of understanding the political problems that we had, the social issues that we had to face, but also was doing that on a one-to-one basis. So I think that's what kept her really in touch with what was going on. But more importantly, the writing. And I think maybe this is a message too for Catholic high school students. The writing is what's going to sustain. We will know Dorothy Day because of the writing, the things that she did with the written word. And today we live in a world where everything is so digital, it's so quickly gone. She wrote for a different reason. She wrote because she really believed that the word had value, that she had to get people's attention through the spoken and written word. And I think the written word is undervalued today. And I think we do ourselves a disservice unless we continue to say that these virtues that we believe in, these things that we think are most important, have to be expressed in word, because word will sustain.
That's great. So Adam, I'm wondering if you can follow up with modern prophets. What does that mean to you and in your classroom work and
Sure.
in your vocation?
I think Martin is so correct with everything he just shared about this. And sometimes young people today, if they're looking for wisdom, at times they're looking for wisdom maybe in the secular culture at times, and for people who may quote unquote be famous, as opposed to looking at faith or faith tradition or role models of faith. And that's not true for everyone. I'm not trying to generalize, but that is common at times. And that's part of growing up too. Being a high schooler, you're trying to find out your identity and somewhat rebel in that discovery. So you might rebel against the church for a short period of time, hopefully a short period of time. But at the same time, there are other figures, just to quickly bring up, once again, these are people who I would say obviously are secular. These are not religious figures in nature. Not that these are not religious people or spiritual people, but there's other people in our society modern day in 2021, like a Bill Gates, who is obviously trying to promote environmental justice, which would connect to Pope Francis's Laudato Si about the importance of taking care of the environment and being stewards. And sometimes he might seem as a person, for some, as controversial. And if so, then maybe he would be some type of quote unquote modern day prophet who's trying to challenge people to see this planet as something we should take care of. Obviously, I'm going a different direction away from Dorothy Day for a moment, but he would be someone who does make some people uncomfortable. Another person in modern history would be Muhammad Ali, and I'll bring him up as my own interest, but also as a person from Louisville, Kentucky, who spoke about racial equality. And as Martin mentioned earlier, the maybe some of the political views of Day were controversial. I would think that we know that Muhammad Ali's, some of his words were controversial as well. And I often wonder when he spoke, if he was not speaking not about himself as quote unquote the greatest, but instead maybe he was trying to challenge people at that time to recognize that the African American community was equally great as the white community in our country, and that everyone deserves a chance to be seen through the eyes of equality and dignity, and through the eyes of God, and not by the color of their skin. And some of his words obviously echo Dr. King's words at that time in the civil rights movement. But these are people, as maybe Muhammad Ali might be more controversial than Bill Gates, but these are still people who they are in their words are challenging the status quo and challenging the way we see the world. And I think that the ultimate goal is that we're trying to seek truth. And I think that they live those type of lives. And I think Dorothy Day is doing the same. How do we take care of our neighbor? How do we see other as through the lens of the gospel, through the lens of the Beatitudes? How do we take care of the person who is sick or homeless? How do we see the marginalized in our community, in our neighborhood? How often do we visit the sick people in our community? And for high schoolers, the same thing is true. We offer service opportunities for them to expose them to the marginalized, so they understand the dignity of all people, not just the people that's inside of their family. or maybe their group of friends.
This has been such a great conversation. I'm so glad to have had you both with us. There's two ways our participants can engage further in this content. One is that through the convention platform, you can access the film and materials beyond this webinar about from Journey Films, so that you can access the film. The other is on the Journey Films website, you have access to the educational materials that Adam and potentially others have developed, so that you can use the film in class at the high school level and have activities and thought processes around that. We are so glad to have had you with us. Final thoughts from either of you?
Well, just from my end, I have to say that I began this work many years ago, and I felt God was calling me to do this work. Some of that, a lot of that actually was shaped in my high school years. But I've come to realize that the opportunities that I get to tell these stories, these films, it's in many ways a sacred trust. You get a sense that what I do is ultimately narrative theology. I'm taking theological ideas and expressing them through the lives of people. But when you get closer to these people and get the opportunity to share their story, you get a sense that there's something bigger at work here. And that's what I clearly felt in the making of the Dorothy Day film. Something bigger was at work. It's hard sometimes to put words to it, exactly what it means, but you just sort of sense that you're dealing with something that's sort of connecting you a little bit more to the divine. And that to me is the biggest thrill. And I'm happy that Adam could help us out and give us some direction in the educational process of it. So teachers and classroom people can figure out how to use this film in different ways, excite them to be able to do it, give them a hand in doing that, and really ultimately encourage them to see that these kind of characters are worth remembering and teaching on.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you all those who are participating today. We appreciate that. You will be surveyed so we can continue to get better in our processes. And God bless each of you in your work. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks for
day.
the opportunity. You too.